All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Fred Anderson. I'm the VP of Sales here at Phosphorus. I'm responsible for all sales as well as customer success. We welcome you to this Verkada Hack webinar. We're going to have a panel discussion today. We've got a few housekeeping items I'm going to walk you through as I get to my next screen. There we go. So for this webinar, all lines have been muted. Please use the question panel in the Zoom meeting to ask any questions. We've got a number of panelists and moderators that will be looking at that question and answer panel to answer all your questions. This webinar is also being recorded for future playback. So you are being recorded today. And also a link to this webinar will be sent out to everybody on the attendee list. So you guys will have a chance to replay that as well. Our agenda this morning, number one, walk you through an introduction of our speakers. Some very high-level security ambassadors have been able to join us for this. We'll talk a little bit about the Verkada hack, what occurred, how it happened, how you prevent it, answer any questions around that. We'll talk about IoT security in the enterprise as well. Of course, you have the obligatory short demonstration on Phosphorus Spyglass, which will be done by Earle, our CTO and co-founder. And then we'll wrap up and talk about how do you guys find additional resources around IoT security. So our speakers, number one, CEO and co-founder of Phosphorus Spyglass, Chris Rulin has joined us. Thank you, Chris. Earle, his partner in crime, or sorry, partner in goodness. CTO and co-founder Earle is on as well, and Richard Stiennon, very famous author. Everyone I feel in the security industry knows all three of these individuals, but Richard's probably the face of all things security in my mind, at least for the last couple of dozen years, I think. So Richard, thank you very much for joining.
Decades.
Couple of decades, couple of dozen of years. Trying to be kind.
Couple dozen. It's actually almost exactly how long I've been in security.
We're all dating ourselves. Well, thank you very much, the three gentlemen on this panel. From a very well-known author, Richard also has a couple of books out there. I highly recommend everybody take a look at these. It all begins with the foundation, and the foundation is the education. And again, Richard, former analyst, won't mention the firm, but somebody that we all can count on for good information and always has his fingers on the pulse of security. So a little bit on the Verkada hack. I'd like to open this up to the panel, and again for the panelists. This is a great opportunity for you all to ask questions, but I think I'll let Chris and Richard kick it off on the Verkada hack. And if you could, maybe start a little bit of a brief overview of what Verkada or who Verkada is, what occurred, and perhaps, again, diving in, how do people prevent something like that from occurring again? Chris, do you want to take a first run at that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first off, this is not surprising to us at all. We founded this company, just really with a concept to see if we could help secure IoT in 2017. And since then, Earle and I have probably had our hands on a million customer devices or so at a very deep level. And we see cameras more often than not have default credentials. And then there's always vendors who include a second backup undocumented credential, which typically in the hacker community you call a backdoor. And those undocumented credentials, they always get discovered. And when you have 150,000 cameras under management with the same backup super user, it's simply a matter of time before they become compromised. And I do think this was more of a hack to demonstrate the vulnerability as opposed to a ransomware attack. Although there could be massive second wave implications if in fact those cameras have been used for pivot and implant. And we don't know that yet. And my odds are on yes, they certainly would be used for persistent compromise of the organizations that they touched. And obviously this is a big problem for Verkada to clean up. but even customers who don't use outsourced video monitoring have the same issue because they've got internal teams monitoring thousands of cameras, which today our camera is really a round shaped Linux box with a lens on it. It's a computer, but we find they're not treated as computers when it comes to the security investment, security budget, and attention.
Thank you, Chris. Richard, would you like to add any comments to that as well?
Yeah, so much to unpack here, because I treat, or as I follow IoT and all the security layers that have to be built into it, it just takes me all the way back to, I think 2003 is a perfect time frame to talk about. Back then we used to talk about hacktivists quite a bit, right? And their stated goals were quite often to prove to the world that Microsoft was just horrible. If you're using Windows, you deserved what happened to you next, as they released, the I love you virus, and, just dozens of worms that spread everywhere. And it convinced us all very, very quickly that we had to do something about it. And I tagged that in actually a curve very similar to the IoT curve you're showing. That was the beginning of an industry that back then was 2 billion in revenue and today is well over 200 billion, all to protect our computing infrastructure, right? Our networks and our desktops and laptops and eventually cell phones. And when you look at what people are doing for IoT, you go, wait a minute, you've got unmanaged devices all over your network, all over your plant floor, all over your city for traffic control and signaling and all the rest of that. You are going to really suffer. And lo and behold, the attacker in the Verkada situation appears to be a pure hacktivist of the old school. The way the FBI talks about him in the indictment that they just filed yesterday, when they're charging the Swiss citizen with these attacks, is, hey, he actually has an ideology of there shouldn't be anything like intellectual property, right? There should be no intellectual property rights, which kind of sounds like the old Pirate Bay guys, right? Who used to steal content and release it for free to everybody. So we've got hacktivists, and hacktivists are enough to drive security adoption. That's great. Next, look for cyber criminals and, of course, nation states. We've got all these vulnerable systems. After the Verkada attack, a lot of other researchers in those organizations are thinking about how could they leverage that for nefarious gains. So watch out for the cybercrime part of this coming. It's pretty good assumption to assume nation states, so-called APTs, are already taking full advantage of any unmanaged IoT devices that you have.
Yeah, and just to riff on that, I mean, you called it out right. When hackers see blood in the water, whether they're legitimate researchers or bad guys, the sharks are circling. And so this is the first time since Mirai, and a much bigger visual impact, if you excuse the comparison, than Mirai, because you can actually see all this stuff. And you bet that everybody who's got the Mirai botnet code is adding in all the latest cameras right now, because if this guy got 150,000, that guy wants to get 1 million. And so this will be the new low-hanging fruit for attackers. And it's not just cameras, it's just one example out of hundreds of different types of device classes we see in enterprise IoT.
Yeah, and this has a cloud aspect too, because Verkada was also capturing the video, right? Because there's kind of a managed solution. So they could see recorded video, which of course is all the interesting stuff that happens in your stairwells and parking lots and all the rest. So quite a trove of stuff they got into. And obviously they're probably not going to be using it very much, since they'll be fighting their legal case.
Yeah, that's an important distinction too, is the notion of cloud managed devices versus not, because when you're buying a cloud managed device, whether that's a camera or a printer, I mean, the expectation is that it's a camera or a printer, not a network sniffer with a hot mic into the room that's exfilling data, right, and launching attacks. And the reality is, when you are bring one of these devices into your environment and put it on your network, you are at the mercy of whoever's managing it and how good their security apparatus is. And what we see time and time again is these attacks on these, providers, whether it's somebody's update distribution server, right, or a cloud managed service like this. These are not sophisticated attacks, right? Even if you look at the Mirai botnet, right, that's infecting all these devices with malware, it's not sophisticated. They're logging in with default passwords, right? And that's the reality of these things. The basic hygiene of securing these devices is not being done. And to Chris's point earlier, these are effectively Linux servers, but they're not thought of and treated like Linux servers, right? And therein lies, a lot of the problem in securing this.
Thank you, guys. So question that came in, and please keep those questions going. One of them is, do we see security best practices being any different for IoT than it is, say, the data center or edge? Any difference in securities?
So I think that's a great question. So it's interesting. So pretty much every enterprise today does have information security policies, right? And typically, almost all of those will have a policy around password management, right? How often do you rotate your passwords, right? Sometimes it's even minimum password strength requirements. And they'll also have a patch policy. How often do you apply vendor patches? So almost all of the IoT in the enterprise is out of compliance with their own policy. And it's because there's no tooling, right? When we ask customers, when was the last time you changed the password on your HVAC system or your door controller or your badge printer, your badge reader? I mean, the answer is almost always, I don't know. And typically they haven't. And we see this time and time again. And so, the fundamental issue is there's no tooling. You have all these different things made by different people that operate in different, ways on the network. So how do you deal with them all? That's, quite frankly, the founding premise of our company is we wanted to solve that. But it is a hard problem.
Earle, do you have a percentage of IoT devices that you've seen in your experience that are at risk of being breached in the enterprise? Is there a percentage you can apply to that?
Yeah. So these fundamental issues of not managing, just doing basic hygiene, right? Changing your passwords on a regular basis, or in most enterprises they have, some of these passwords haven't even been changed once. So 100% of our customers, we find hundreds, if not thousands, of embedded devices on their default factory passwords, and sometimes that's no password. This isn't just cameras, right? This is everything: elevator controllers, badge printers, badge readers, distribution robots. I mean, you name it. It's just not being done. And, we've seen customers, with having over 50% of their IoT devices with default passwords. It really just depends, on what types of devices, what business vertical you're talking about. And on the patching, the situation's even worse. We actually see on average that more devices in an enterprise that are out of date on their firmware than are current when it comes to the IoT. Now, I know IoT is kind of a little bit of a loaded term, but we're specifically talking about embedded devices where you cannot run agents, right? Where you cannot run, your Tanium agent to keep the software up to date. You cannot run, an agent to rotate the password. So being able to manage these devices has to be done agentlessly. Another interesting statistic is old things in your environment. Right? So out of every device we've ever seen across every customer we have, 26% of them have been end of life, which is just a staggering percentage. And so some of these devices may not have even had an available patch in a decade. And so, you can imagine how good security was on desktops a decade ago. You can project about, the quality of security on an embedded device from a decade ago.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Earle. And I think that it led on to another question we had of how do you prevent some of these things. So it was good to hear you talk about credential management, leveraging credentials, as well as keeping things patched. I think that's probably an area a lot of folks would struggle with in IoT. Richard, from your perspective, can you give us, and I think you sort of touched on a little bit with this slide in the background, a little bit of a description of what you feel enterprise IoT consists of today?
Yeah, there's several aspects, right? Because some enterprises actually manufacture IoT devices, and I'm in Detroit, so I think of the automotive industry, which we're more and more just treating like big IoT devices, right? They've got hundreds of computers on them, each an individual IoT. But of course, those end up in the hands of consumers, and those could be super dangerous if those vehicles are like Teslas and self-driving. And then there's, what we think of as the, the regular enterprise, right? People doing office work and, advertising stuff for us and all the rest. And their IoT is, things that help them collaborate and get work done, right? So conference room, conference room phones, and the cameras associated with those. And now, and that back a year ago when I used to go to people's offices, the television screens that were attached to them as well. That of course they put up all their financials on and everything else. So those are, high-end IoT devices, security cameras, and then manufacturers who on their plant floor have thousands of controllers, pumps if they're in, fluid and gas processing. We saw what happened to those devices in Natanz when a worm, Stuxnet, actually got in and destroyed them. If they had been patching not only the controllers for those, but the actual devices, they could have defended against that. And of course, every manufacturer has digital controls now on their manufacturing processes. And the last thing you want is for a robot who's in a paint booth to swing around and whack the guy who's maintaining the booth at the time.
Well, good description. Thank you, Richard. Appreciate that. Any other questions? Keep sending them in. Thank you all for the questions that were submitted. I think that one more question, personally for me that I would have is, if I'm a security practitioner, and let's just say everybody on this call is all wearing white hats and we're all good people, if there's one best practice that I could do in the enterprise to avoid something like a Verkada instance to happen to me, and maybe as a manufacturer and non-manufacturer as well, what would that one thing be? Is there a one thing that people can do?
Well,
I know my answer.
Go ahead. Go for it.
But Earl's going to say the exact same thing, right? It's change the default password. And that goes for the consumers too, right? So your Nest device, your refrigerator, your whatever, change the default password.
Yeah, that's definitely it. Because like even if you patched your firmware, it's irrelevant if you haven't changed the password. And then there's an important distinction too on the cloud managed devices, right? I mean, vendor reputation is everything. I mean, we see, IoT and these embedded devices is very much the Wild West. I mean, we see devices when they come from the manufacturer and you take it out of the box, it's already malicious. So, buy from reputable vendors, have a good inventory of what's on your network and have a mechanism to discover these things, manage the passwords first and foremost.
We do also find thousands of critical CVEs as well, but I totally agree. Passwords should be changed first. And that's the easiest thing to do when you have automation. If you're trying to do it by hand, it logs up into thousands of man hours pretty quickly. Earle, what do you think the most significant IoT device that we've found has been, or that surprised you? I've got my opinions, but I'm curious what you think.
I think it kind of breaks down by vertical. I mean, financial services versus healthcare. I think that, in terms of, surprising and from a risk perspective, I mean, we've seen organizations that might have, a 10-figure budget for IT security, but, you can log in to the door controller with a default password and unlock every building, every door in the building, including the front door, right? So, I think that, IoT is very much just, not part of the typical security apparatus when it comes to remediation.
Yeah, I like the atomic clocks that sync trades.
Yeah,
that are running embedded Linux and haven't had any password change on them. Also, one of my personal favorites that I think is very high impact are KVM switches. And turns out most KVM switches are running a full-on Linux stack, and they haven't been patched for a decade. So if you think about the oxymoron that you've got a KVM controlling up to 128 pieces of metal servers, but the keyboard and virtual mouse are actually totally insecure in the first place.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point too, Chris, because the class of vulnerabilities that we see on these embedded devices is not sophisticated, right? This is not like, you know, when you see CVEs today in modern browsers or SSH protocols, like they're very sophisticated attacks involving cryptography and complex timing attacks, or, you know, memory and sandboxing escapes. But the vulnerability class on these IoT devices, you can go look at CVE's release yesterday. These are exploits where you can literally type in the exploit in the URL bar in your browser, right? These are not sophisticated attacks. And the reason's simple, right? The source code for the browsers and the SSH protocols and the TLS, those have been reviewed for decades by millions of developers and researchers and bad actors. Most of these IoT devices have never been scrutinized. And the class of vulnerabilities reflects that.
So one question came through the number of IoT devices. Is there a percentage of how many of those exist versus number of employees? And the follow-on question in there is that why IoT is such a target? Because perception is that there's more IoT devices than there are laptops.
Yeah, and it's there's not only more, but it's easier, right? I mean, you don't have to run some complicated exploit that relies on a bunch of you know, settings and configurations to be possible. You just log in with admin or whatever the credential is. And there's also automated tooling to go and hack these things. I mean, if you look at like the Mirai botnet, perfect example, right? There's, you know, adversaries have automated tools to find these things on your network and infect them with malware, and it's using the default passwords. Right.
Yeah, and when you think about how many IoT devices you interact with, you know, in a normal world where you walk into work, right? You're walking by a half dozen security cameras. There are probably 5 or 6 printers within 10 meters of where you sit. There are occupancy sensors. There are door badge readers. There are elevators, escalators. All these devices, we typically see add up to 3 to 5 devices per employee, or about 25 to 30% of the network itself is actually embedded unmanaged devices. And if you look at that from a spend perspective, you see 70% of the network spending an immense amount of resources securing it, 30% being ignored. And while we definitely see chum in the water for attackers to go after IoT, and there has been nation state efforts for some time now as well, as it's just coming out that printers have been under attack for over a decade when they were largely ignored. So printers are very important to us. You know, I think that the big hit's going to be from the auditors. Everybody gets a third-party audit every year. And the auditors, they already realize that the servers are locked down, the apps are locked down, the desktops are locked down. The next thing the auditors are looking at is this. We had one customer who was failing an audit where we rotated 13,000 credentials in, I think, about 3 hours, and then patched those devices the next day in about 4 hours because they were failing an audit. And so, you know, securing these devices is one way to stay ahead of the auditors.
That's great. Well, thank you. Again, very grateful, Chris, Earle, and Richard, for the conversation around this. Any closing comments anybody would like to make before we continue on?
I was just thinking of an example, probably my proudest moment of a pen tester, which I used to do full time at PricewaterhouseCoopers. But at the time I was living in an apartment, and my cleaning lady locked herself out of her car, and it had one of those new, this is 20 years ago, one of those new keypads on it, numbered. And, you know, I kind of said, let me see if I can guess the password, because she had just bought it used and she didn't know the password. And it was a 6-digit keypad. That should be plenty, right? It's better than 4. My first try was 135642, and that opened it because I just looked at it, put myself in the same place as the owner. How can I remember this password and not use my birthday or something? And that was it. She thought I was pretty hot.
That's good. That's basic. Thank you, Richard. And that was a point that I did not know about you. So it's interesting. Thanks. Chris or Earle, anything to close out before we continue on here?
No, I think I can tell you as an entrepreneur in this space, it's exciting because we always get surprised. Like every day it's what the heck did this thing do? And so it's very interesting. It's a big moving target. It has a long tail on it as well. And it's a hard problem, which is why we're excited to work on it. You know, we don't want to work on problems that other people have already solved. We want to find new solutions, and this space seemed very much like a green field, and it turns out it certainly is.
Thank you, Chris. And I think you said it earlier, right? This is the low-hanging fruit. Obviously, it seems like a softball. Hey, the first thing you need to do is put passwords on everything. But as anyone who's ever been in security, or anyone who's ever had an apartment or lived in a home would say, yeah, I'm going to lock my front door. And that's probably the basics, right? And why you guys created Phosphorus Spyglass. So what's up next? We'll walk into a demonstration, which Earle is going to kick off for us. But what we want to go ahead and present to you is what Phosphorus Spyglass does. As you'd expect, it does handle the passwords as you'd expect. You know, it is identifying all the IoT embedded devices on your network, and then of course patching of these critical CVEs, as Chris pointed out. So it's you know, those things seem very simple, but when you have 10,000 employees and 30,000 IoT devices, that can kind of be overwhelming. And so Earle will demonstrate how quickly we can walk through those items. Earle, I'm going to pass this over to you. I can stop my screen. Do you have screen sharing capabilities? I believe you do.
Yes, we do. Okay, everybody can see this?
Yes, we can.
All right, so yeah, so this is our product. And, you know, as Fred was mentioning, you know, the goal of this product is really simple, right? We wanted to build enterprise software to allow enterprise customers to remediate the two biggest risks associated with IoT in their enterprise. And that is really simple. It's managing the passwords and applying vendor patches. And so the way that we do that is pretty novel. So, you know, I know that the focus today was really on cameras, but we support, you know, every type of embedded device you can imagine. And actually I got a partial list here, right? So it's not just cameras. Our definition of IoT is embedded devices that you cannot run third-party software. So while cameras and printers are, you know, big corpuses of devices in the enterprise that fall into that category, you also have your IP phones, your badge readers, your alarm systems, your access control, your HVAC, your satellite receivers. You get it. None of these devices can be managed by running agents, right? So you have to have an agentless solution to be able to manage these devices. And so that's kind of what our product is focused on. So the first thing we do when we walk into a customer is get an inventory of everything in your environment. Now you can see right off the bat that we have very specific information and high, we call this high resolution, high def visibility, where we know very specific information about these devices. Now in most enterprises, visibility is tackled in a two-pronged approach. One is with in-bad products. So that would be like Forescouts and Armises, technologies where there's an appliance, whether it's virtual or physical, that's plugged into a network span port and collecting traffic passively. And then there's the second approach, which is scanning using legacy scanners. What we find with the legacy scanning technologies is they do not identify IoT accurately. And there's a lot of reasons why. But in addition to not being able to identify things well, they also can have adverse effects. And that's because the legacy scanning companies aren't asset identification companies, they're vulnerability assessment companies. And as a byproduct of doing vulnerability assessment against random things on the network in 2021 is that, when you see something on your network that might be running a service that you think is a MySQL database, and then you send it a bunch of vulnerability requests to see if it's vulnerable, it's not actually a MySQL database, it's a robot on a distribution floor, and now you've crashed it, right? And so scanning today has become a very high touch, effort that has to be scheduled, coordinated, and it's a big pain in the butt in most enterprises. So we have our own discovery capability, and what you can see here is the output of that. And there's fundamental different approach to how we're doing how we're doing discovery versus the legacy scanners. And we do not crash devices. So we're running our discovery in production, on trading days on Wall Street firms, 24/7. We do not have adverse effects on devices from our discovery. And that is a huge differentiator. Because now, whereas, with legacy scanners, you have to coordinate it. It's typically done once a quarter. Now it can be done constantly. We also have partnerships and integration with the NBAD providers like Forescout and Armis. And so once we have visibility into the environment, then we can start doing some interesting things. So what we do for our demos, we're actually going to use a couple cameras today. So I got this camera here above my head, and you can see all this equipment we have over on the racks next to us. Now, I know with the Verkada incident, we were talking about cloud managed services. So we deliver our product, it can be completely on premise. So it does not talk to the cloud, does not send your data to the cloud. It's real enterprise class software. We can also even cater to air gap networks where it can be deployed somewhere where there is no internet connectivity, right? But we just deliver a virtual machine. There's no hardware, appliance that comes with this, right? It's just we just deliver a virtual machine. So coming to this camera here, you can see this is the .117 camera. We can pull this up in our product, and you can see that this is an Axis M3104 LVE, and we have a bunch of high fidelity and high resolution data here. We actually know the hardware ID for this camera. We have a part number and a serial number. Most IoT manufacturers map firmware versions to device models, right? And that's how you would typically go and get a patch. You go to the vendor's website, you click on support, type in some part number, right? Download something, right? And it's usually by the model version of the device. Well, these Axis cameras actually have multiple firmwares for different models because they have different hardware platforms. So you have to have this really specific information from these devices to be able to actually identify them well and control them and manage them, right? And so you can see we have all this specific information on this Axis camera. We even know what firmware version it's running. We even know when it was released. It's been marked as being vulnerable because it's got all these CVEs. Now this Axis camera in this configuration right here, as we're looking at it, is how it looks when you take it out of the box, right? And so like most IoT devices, right, it's really out of date. A lot of the updates have CVEs, and it's also got a default password. So when we see devices that have default passwords, we automatically enroll it into your PAM infrastructure. So we have integrations with all of the major commercial PAM vendors. CyberArk would be the most prominent that we see in the enterprise. And then on the open source side, HashiCorp Vault. And so we will store these passwords inside your existing PAM infrastructure, where then now the passwords managed by your PAM infrastructure, just like all the passwords on your desktops and servers. So now customers can manage passwords on these embedded devices using the exact same tools that they're already using. And the way it works is simple. We act as the gateway for the PAM tool. So we can actually click a button to rotate the password on this device. So just to be clear, the default password on these Axis cameras, we have it logging here for this demo. You can see it's root and pass, which is of course why they get hacked by automated tools. So we can actually click a button to change the password ad hoc in our user interface. You can also do it through the PAM tool. And so you can see that the password's been changed. And if I come over here to the camera, you see I've been kicked out because root pass doesn't work anymore, right? And if we come back over here, we can look up the password right in our product just by clicking on a button. You'll see now it's got a nice random password. I can copy that to my clipboard, come back over here and paste it in and log in. So we change the passwords on the devices, right? It doesn't matter if you have one of these or you have 10,000. It's not just cameras, right? We support tens of thousands of different device types, from everything you'd expect to see in the enterprise, from your HVAC systems, your door controllers, et cetera. There's obviously a lot of technology on under the hood. A couple interesting things to point out about changing passwords on things though. One is the password policies. So unlike traditional computers today that have very robust password support, right? If you think on a modern Linux computer, you can have like a 100-character password, right? But these IoT devices typically do not have robust policies. This Axis camera is not bad. It actually, on these old firmwares, you can still have mixed cases, special symbols, et cetera. But not all IoT devices are like this. We see industrial controllers where you can only have a 4-character password and it has to be numbers. So how do you deal with this? Well, the answer is actually, it's simple using our product. We understand the password policy support for all of these different devices. So when we're onboarding it into your PAM infrastructure, we're providing the password policy. So when the PAM tool generates the password, first and foremost, it will work. And secondly, it'll be the strongest configuration possible. We can also show you what the delta is between your information security policy requirements on passwords and what your devices in your environment support. Unfortunately, in most enterprises, there's a very big gap on a large portion of the IoT just because they just don't have very sophisticated password capabilities. The other issue, the technical challenge with changing the passwords is these IoT devices not only move around the network logically, but they move around physically. Unlike, a server that's running an agent, right? Typically, it's put in an equipment rack or on a desk. It doesn't move too often. They have fixed addresses and everything else. These the IP addresses on IoT device are typically not fixed. That means the IP addresses change. We have customers where sometimes it changes every 4 hours from a short DHCP lease time. So you have to be able to track these devices as they move around the network, because once you change the password on it, if I have 1,500 of these cameras and they all switch IPs, how do I resolve what password works on what device? So it's quite a technical challenge, but our product solves that problem and is able to track these. But not only can we track these devices as they move around logically on the network, we can track them as they move around physically on the network. And if you take a device like, let's take something ubiquitous like an HP printer. So when we look at an HP printer, you'll see that the metadata that we have changes, because the metadata that we're able to extract from these devices by talking to them in the way that they're meant to be talked to, varies based on what type of device it is. So we have serial numbers, manufacturing IDs, model numbers, etc. But these printers actually are an interesting challenge for managing passwords, because not only do they get new IP addresses as they change, their leasing at their DHCP leases on the network, but people move these things, right? They might unplug it and physically move buildings or move offices. And maybe it even moves from having an Ethernet connection to a Wi-Fi. So you can't actually track by MAC address because the MAC address could change. So our technology handles all of these edge cases as these devices move throughout your environment, and allows you to bring all these IoT devices into compliance with your InfoSec policy. So they're all getting unique passwords and they're being rotated on a regular basis. In addition to be able to manage the passwords through our interface ad hoc, where you can do bulk actions like change all the passwords at once or update firmware, you can also do it through your PAM tool. So I have a CyberArk instance here, and we have one of these devices loaded into CyberArk, and we can show you what that would look like in the context of a CyberArk console. So you can see I've got another access camera here. That's this one, and just like through our platform, you can click a button right in your PAM tool to change the password. And that's actually going to change the password on this camera. Now, CyberArk queues these requests, so this can actually take up to a minute. And when it happens, you'll see the little green alert, and then we'll be kicked out of the camera, which we'll show you here in a second. So there goes the password change, right? And if you see over here, I was logged into it. Now root pass doesn't work, all right? And if we come back here to the product, I can actually click log into device. Oops, let me interrogate it again. I'll be able to click on login to device. I have to do it this way. Show password. Sorry, I forgot I'm using CyberArk again. I can show password. Here's the new password. I can copy that to my clipboard, come back over here, paste it, and log in. And so it changes the passwords on the device. And so, by using these, by using your PAM tool, again, it's the basic hygiene of changing the passwords across these devices. So as this camera comes back up, we're going to use this camera here to now demonstrate a firmware update on a device. So in addition to managing passwords, you also need to be able to manage the firmware on these devices. So most of these devices, again, when they come from the manufacturer, the firmware is very out of date. So we use these polycoms to demonstrate the firmware update, mainly because you can see something happen when you update it. Most devices, when you're updating the firmware on something, it's a pretty boring thing to try to demo because there's nothing to see, right? The device just goes offline, and if you did everything right, it comes back online. But these polycoms, the lights will flash, so it'll put on a good demo. So you can see we got a sticker on this polycom. It's the 102, and that's this one. You see it's a VVX410. It's got out-of-date firmware. This is what it looks like when it comes from, you take it out of the box. You can see just how out of date this one is. This is the version it's running, and you can see how many updates are available. It's also got a default password, something silly. Yep, the default password on a Polycom device is 456. So again, why you need to change your password. And just like the passwords, we make this simple. I can click a button to install the firmware, and then I'm going to switch over to the camera. So, you don't even actually have to click the button. We can completely automate this, right? It doesn't matter if you have one of these or you have 10,000. But right now, there's a queue put into a job job put into a queue for a worker to go and update this device. The worker picked up that job up out of the queue, authenticated with the PAM tool to get the credential, and then authenticated with the device where it performs a whole swath of pre-flight checks to validate what's about to happen. What type of device is this? Am I sure? What firmware version is it on? And then being able to do all the technical details, like following upgrade and downgrade paths, cryptographically verifying the firmware that's about to be installed on it, et cetera. And then performing the update, which you can see happen now with the lights flashing. So again, it doesn't matter if you have one of these or you have 10,000, you can completely automate it. We can even do the automation by integrating with your existing security apparatus. So if you want to manage the firmware on these devices through an orchestration layer like Demisto, or straight from your in-bag console, whether that's Armis or Forescout, or programmatically through our API, all of those can be done. We can do complex scheduling based on time, based on device type, etc. But that's the meat of our product, right? We want to be able to remediate these two big risks. Now, there's a whole bunch of other neat features and functionalities and security enrichments we do, but that's the general premise here. Perform these basic hygiene tasks that are not done, which is change the passwords and apply vendor patches. That is the best approach. And quite honestly, those things are table stakes in desktops and servers, and it's just not being done on embedded devices.
Thank you, Earle. Great demonstration. Any questions, please pop them into the question window again. Earle, I'm going to take over your screen share real quick.
Right.
All righty. All right,
Earle, you do such good demos. I love those.
He does. We're quite privileged. Thanks, Richard. And again, thank you, Earle. I know we covered a couple of quick topics in a short time period. If I could get my slides to move again. There we are. All right, thank you. So again, pop any questions you have into the window, and we will get them answered for you. But just to reiterate, for us, the solution at Phosphorus is really around remediating the basic vulnerabilities that any device could have, but we are looking solely at embedded enterprise IoT devices. You'll hear it from any security practitioner out there today. Number one is knowing what is on your network. For us here at Phosphorus, we see that as quite the challenge in the IoT space, because IoT has only been around, quote unquote, since 2015 as a term. Prior to that, it was machine-to-machine networks. Most of the tools that go out there and do the scanning and the interrogation today weren't built and prepared for that. So number one, enriched IoT data. That's what we provide. Number two, identifying those key vulnerabilities, such as default or weak passwords, as well as critical and high CVEs that need to be patched. Again, think of this at scale, not easy to do when you've got 30,000 devices that you need to hit on. And then also enforcing IoT compliance with remediation and workflows. Earle pointed it out, complete tie-in. Again, this is a product that was built here in the last 3 years, millions of dollars invested in making sure that this is something that interoperated with all the other security products that you've bought to close that gap that we know the enterprise customer has today. So that's the key part of what we're doing. And again, really tightly integrated with other vendors. Earle pointed it out there with CyberArk. We've got a number of credential management providers that we work with, and then a lot of integration partners that you would expect. Earle said it, right? The Forescouts, the Armis, the ServiceNow, et cetera. So there's quite a bit of integration. So again, for us, specifically addressing those biggest threats in the IoT space, eliminating the possibility of any customer becoming, quote unquote, the next Verkada victim at that. Any closing comments, Richard or Earle or Chris?
Just back to my thoughts on, how we're in early days of doing IoT security well. And that's what attracts me so much to Phosphorus is, changing passwords, updating firmware, that should be table stakes for IoT security. And yet nobody's got it. Nobody knows how to do it. And Phosphorus comes in and just makes it easy. As Earle pointed out, it's push button scheduled, just gives you peace of mind.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I would just riff and say, I've been doing security startups my entire adult life, and This one, I think, has the biggest impact on securing customers than anything I've ever done. So it's very exciting.
Thank you, Chris. And Earl, thank you again. For everybody who's joined, very, very grateful for your time this morning. For us, we would say that, we look for the opportunity to demonstrate this in your private environment. We look at POVs as something that, again, we want to show that value. We want to tie this back to, that concern that you have in your mind. Please follow us on LinkedIn. You'll see the Phosphorus page on LinkedIn. Follow us on Twitter as well. We have a new website launch going up in 2 weeks, so we'll have a lot of great blog content to start to educate the masses on the security problems that are out there. There are a lot. It's very difficult to keep up with. The White House and prior administrations, this administration are focusing heavily on IoT in 2021 for a reason, right? Because there is a big risk out there. And again, for anyone who wants to have a POP on site, it's a very light lift for you as a prospect or as a customer for us to come in and do that POP. Please contact us at contact@phosphorus.io. My name is Fred Anderson. I'm Fred at phosphorus.io. Let me know if you have any other questions. And with that, I wish you guys a great weekend. And again, thank you to our panelists for educating us. We're very, very grateful. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred.
And that ends our recording.